The twin suns of Varith burned like fiery eyes upon the desolate landscape, casting harsh shadows over the winding streets of Khorath City. A fusion of ancient desert architecture and surreal, alien bioforms stretched out like the remnants of forgotten civilizations. Domed buildings with sweeping organic curves appeared to have grown from the sand rather than been built. Zarek Harlow adjusted his helmet's visor, feeling the oppressive heat even through his military-grade environmental suit. His legs were weary, his boots kicking up the thick, orange dust as he trudged along the deserted streets. It had been a long day of negotiations with the Khorathian Trade Consortium, one that had dragged on far longer than expected. And now, with the sun at its peak, he was left with no choice but to return to his quarters on foot. The city was mostly empty at this hour. The locals, attuned to the savage heat, knew better than to brave the midday sun. Yet as Zarek rounded a corner, he saw a figure huddled beneath the shadow of a massive building, a stark contrast to the empty streets. The figure was humanoid but unmistakably alien. Her skin shimmered in the harsh sunlight with a ghostly blue hue, as if she were made of light itself. Her long, white hair cascaded around her shoulders, and her dark, intelligent eyes followed Zarek's every move. She wore simple, ragged clothing, nothing unusual in a city like Khorath, but there was something ethereal about her presence, something that set her apart. Zarek's instincts urged him to keep walking, to ignore the stranger, but something in her gaze stopped him cold. As if sensing his hesitation, the woman spoke. "You are far from home, human," she said, her voice melodic but tinged with an edge of caution. He wasn't sure why, but his heart skipped a beat. "Yeah, it's been a long day," Zarek muttered, wiping the sweat from his brow. "The heat here, it's something else? Heat? Or something more?" Her eyes flickered with curiosity, yet there was something deeper in her expression, something guarded. Zarek's hand involuntarily reached into his pack, where he kept a rare, precious food source. A protein-laced sustenance bar, a treat only a few frontier dwellers ever tasted. With a quick glance at her, he pulled it out, holding it toward her. "It's not much, but I'm guessing you could use something." She stared at the bar as though it were some forbidden relic, eyeing Zarek with wariness. "Humans give away food in places like this?" Zarek smiled, shrugging. "We're not all the same. I've been through hard times too. If I can help, I will." He set the bar down in front of her, but before he could turn away, she spoke again. "What's your name?" "Zarek Harlow," he replied, pausing for a moment. Something about her gaze made him linger. "Take care of yourself." As he walked away, Zarek couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just another starving wanderer. There was a mystery there. He couldn't put it out of his mind even as the heat of the twin suns bore down on him. 3 days later, Zarek stood in the grand hall of the Khorathian sovereign's palace, feeling very much out of place. The intricate architecture was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Archways that seemed to bend and twist in ways that defied physics, walls adorned with pulsating bioluminescent veins, artifacts from dozens of alien civilizations, some of which he could barely comprehend. It was beautiful, but Zarek was too focused on the negotiations ahead to admire it. A deep voice interrupted his thoughts. "Ah, Ambassador Harlow, welcome to my humble palace." Zarek turned to face Sovereign Talon, an imposing figure clad in ceremonial robes that shimmered like the night sky. But it was the figure standing next to him that caused Zarek's breath to catch in his throat. There, beside the Sovereign, was the woman from the streets, the one he had given his last sustenance bar to. But she wasn't ragged and dusty anymore. She stood tall and composed, radiant in a gown of dark, iridescent fabric that seemed to catch the light of the palace's bioluminescence. She was no longer the mysterious wanderer. She was Princess Veyla, daughter of Talon, the ruler of Khorath. Zarek's mind raced and his tongue stumbled. I didn't expect." The princess caught his eye, offering a knowing smile. "I believe we've met before. I never did thank you for your kindness." Her voice was soft but filled with an undeniable command. Talon's booming voice cut in, clearly amused. "Indeed. My daughter has an interesting way of meeting important individuals. I trust you two will enjoy our discussions." The exchange between Zarek and Veyla was subtle but electric. As they walked deeper into the palace, the princess leaned in, her voice low. "That sustenance bar was quite a gift," she whispered, her eyes locking with his. "I wonder, Zarek, if your generosity extends to other areas?" Her words lingered, and Zarek's thoughts began to swirl. This was no simple diplomatic meeting. There were politics at play, he knew that. But Veyla's presence, her magnetic allure, was a complication he hadn't prepared for. Her eyes glinted with more than curiosity. There was a spark in her gaze that spoke of a deeper connection, one that was more personal than professional. The following days turned into an intricate dance of diplomacy, but Zarek couldn't help but notice how the princess seemed to always find ways to engage him more intimately, be it a gentle touch on his arm during a conversation, a shared glance across the dinner table, or a private walk through the palace gardens. It was all part of a game, he told himself. But the longer he stayed in Khorath, the more he realized that he was no longer certain which side he was on. "Tell me," Veyla said one evening as they sat under the stars, the bioluminescent flora casting an otherworldly glow around them. "How do humans decide who they will be with? Is it truly about love, or do you two use logic and reason?" Zarek hesitated. "It's more complicated than that," he said softly. "It's about choice. We choose who we trust, who we care for." She smiled, a slow, knowing curve of her lips. "Choice," she repeated, leaning closer. "How curious." Later that night, Zarek found himself torn between the desires of his heart and the duties he was sworn to fulfill. Was Veyla just playing him? Or was there something more, a shared understanding neither could resist? Every conversation with her blurred the lines between duty and passion. And when she mentioned a concept called the binding, an ancient Khorathian tradition that allowed the nobility to bind themselves to a person of their choice, it became clear that the stakes had risen far beyond a simple trade agreement. What Zarek didn't know, however, was that Veyla's intentions were far more complex than he had imagined. The binding was not merely a romantic gesture, it was a political weapon. And Zarek had unknowingly walked right into the heart of a palace conspiracy that could change the fate of not just Khorath, but the entire sector. As the tension between them reached its peak, Zarek realized he wasn't just fighting for his own desires anymore. He was tangled in a web of politics, betrayal, and a future that might not allow for either love or loyalty. The following days blurred into a haze of diplomatic meetings and clandestine moments. Zarek had expected to be consumed by the political intricacies of his mission, negotiating the terms of the trade agreement between the United Earth Confederation and the Khorathian Trade Coalition. But Veyla's presence, her very aura, disrupted every calculation in his mind. The palace, despite its beauty, had become a labyrinth. He wandered its corridors, attended meetings with the sovereign, and exchanged pleasantries with various dignitaries, but his thoughts never strayed far from the enigmatic princess. She seemed to be everywhere, waiting in the gardens, strolling through the hallways with a quiet grace, or appearing at the dining table with that inscrutable smile that left him wondering whether he was a player in her game or merely a pawn. Zarek had never been one to mix business with pleasure, but with Veyla, everything felt blurred. Every glance, every touch, felt deliberate, like a push toward something neither of them fully understood. He caught himself thinking of her when he should have been focusing on the terms of the trade, the long-term implications for Earth's interests. But Veyla was becoming a distraction, and the consequences of that distraction were becoming clearer by the day. One evening, as Zarek stood on the balcony overlooking the bioluminescent gardens, trying to collect his thoughts, he heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching. His heart skipped a beat before he turned, expecting yet another meeting with the sovereign. But it wasn't Talon. It was her. Veyla stood in the doorway, her silver gown shimmering with every movement. She looked like a goddess of the night, bathed in the glow of the palace's surrounding lights. Her eyes, those liquid pools of mercury, locked onto his with the same intensity they had the first day they met. There was no mistaking it now. She knew exactly how to command attention. "You look troubled," she said, her voice a soft hum in the cool evening air. Zarek swallowed hard. He should have been more guarded. Yet, with her so close, the walls he'd built up began to crumble. "It's nothing," he muttered, though he knew it wasn't true. Everything about this place felt wrong, especially when she was near. "Nothing?" She arched an eyebrow, a playful glint in her gaze. "You're a terrible liar, Zarek Harlow." She stepped forward, closing the gap between them. Her presence was overpowering. He felt like he couldn't breathe. "I think you're lying to yourself," she continued softly, her hand grazing the edge of his arm. "The truth is you're conflicted. Torn between duty and something else." Zarek flinched at the implication, taking a step back. "I'm here for one thing, the trade deal. Nothing more." Veyla tilted her head, her lips curving into a sly smile. "Then why do I feel like I've become your greatest distraction?" His heart hammered in his chest, but he fought to steady his voice. "This," he gestured to the palace, the glowing gardens, the delicate tension between them. "This isn't part of the plan. I've got a job to do." Her smile faltered just for a second, but it was enough to make Zarek pause. Something about that fleeting expression told him that perhaps she wasn't entirely in control either. "Zarek," she said, her voice lowering to a whisper. "You think I don't understand what you're feeling? You think I don't know what it's like to be trapped by duty?" He looked at her, then truly looked at her. Veyla was more than a princess. There was pain beneath the surface, a vulnerability that only showed in fleeting moments. In the silence that followed, it was as if they were two souls on the edge of something dangerous and irreversible. Before he could say anything, she reached into the folds of her gown and pulled out something unexpected. A small, iridescent crystal, glowing faintly in her palm. It was beautiful, no more than that. It was ancient, pulsing with a soft light that seemed to hum with an energy Zarek couldn't comprehend. "What is that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Veyla's eyes flickered with something close to regret, and then she pressed the crystal into his hand. "A binding crystal," she said quietly. "A symbol of the heart's choice. A tradition of my people." Zarek turned the crystal over in his palm, sensing the weight of it, though it was so light. "Binding? What do you mean?" Her gaze became serious, her voice dropping to an almost inaudible murmur. "In Khorathian culture, the heart's choice allows a person to choose their partner. Their true partner. But there's more to it than just love or desire. It is a bond, one that cannot be broken." Zarek's throat went dry. "And you're telling me this? Why?" Veyla stepped closer, her breath warm against his skin. "Because I need to know, Zarek Harlow. Are you willing to make that choice?" His heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. This wasn't just about trade agreements anymore. This wasn't a simple negotiation. What she was offering, or maybe asking, was far more than he could have ever anticipated. "What would it mean, Veyla?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "To choose you?" Her eyes softened. "It would mean that you stand beside me regardless of the consequences. Regardless of what happens next." He could feel the weight of her words, the intensity in her gaze, but he also knew there was something more at play here. Something political, something dangerous. He couldn't allow himself to be swept away by emotion, by the magnetic pull between them. Not when the fate of the entire sector hung in the balance. And yet, part of him wanted to make that choice. To stand beside her, to explore what this feeling was that twisted in his chest. Veyla took another step closer, her face inches from his. "You feel it too," she whispered. "You're not immune to what we could be." Zarek's mind screamed for him to pull away, to keep his focus on the mission. But his body was betraying him. Slowly, carefully, he reached up, brushing a strand of her silver hair behind her ear. Her skin was cool to the touch, like ice and fire all at once. The contact sent a jolt through him, and he realized, too late, that he was already too far gone. But before he could speak, a sudden harsh clang echoed through the palace. Both of them stiffened. From the hall, a voice bellowed, urgent and sharp. "Sovereign Talon requires you both immediately. There's been an incident." Veyla's eyes flashed, the moment between them fractured. Without another word, she turned on her heel and strode toward the door. Zarek stood frozen, the binding crystal still pressed against his palm, his chest tight with questions and desires he couldn't yet understand. He followed her, his heart in turmoil. Zarek's mind was in a whirlwind as he followed Veyla through the labyrinthine halls of the palace. The urgent call had come from Sovereign Talon himself, but something in the tone of the message had unsettled him. It wasn't the usual calm command of a ruler, but something more pressing, panicked even. Veyla moved swiftly ahead, her silver gown flowing behind her like a comet's tail, but Zarek couldn't shake the feeling that whatever lay ahead, it would change everything. They reached the royal chambers, where guards were stationed, faces grim. The door to the sovereign's inner sanctum stood open, and Zarek noticed the faint glow of bioluminescent veins running along the walls, casting an eerie light on the gathering inside. Talon, tall and imposing, stood at the center of the room, his face unusually pale. "What's happening?" Zarek demanded, his gaze flickering between Veyla and the sovereign. Talon's expression was tight, his usual regal composure fraying. "There's been an assassination attempt. Someone is targeting the royal family." Zarek felt a chill creep up his spine. "Who?" Talon's eyes darted to Veyla, and then, with reluctance, he answered. "It's one of the High Council members. Caius. We believe he's orchestrating a coup." Veyla's jaw clenched, her mercury eyes narrowing as she absorbed the information. Zarek noticed how her posture shifted. Something about her seemed to solidify, as if the vulnerability he had seen in her earlier had vanished. The princess was no longer a distraction. She was a force to be reckoned with. "Caius?" Veyla's voice was steady, but Zarek could hear the faint tremor underneath. He's one of the most trusted men in the coalition. Are you certain? Talon nodded gravely. His followers have infiltrated key positions within the city. We found the evidence hidden in his private chambers. It was meant to be subtle, but now we must act. Zarek stepped forward. What do you need me to do? The Sovereign looked at him, a flash of uncertainty passing over his face before it was replaced by something else: determination. You are Earth's representative, Zarek Harlow. If Treacherous has the Coalition's backing, this could turn into an intergalactic conflict. We need you to assist in securing our trade routes and prevent the escalation of war. Your planet's knowledge of military strategy will be invaluable. Zarek nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. A coup, on Khorath Prime, in the very heart of their power. He had barely arrived, and now the very foundation of the Coalition was shaking. There was no telling who could be trusted. Veyla turned sharply to him, her expression unreadable. You're asking him to stand in the middle of a war, Father? Talon sighed. I'm asking him to help prevent one. If Treacherous succeeds, the Coalition will fracture, and all the progress you've made with Earth's trade deals will be meaningless. A heavy silence filled the room. Zarek felt his gaze lock with Veyla's, the unspoken words hanging between them. This wasn't just about trade anymore. This was about survival. He was about to be thrust into something far more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. Before he could respond, a guard burst through the door. Sovereign. We've located the assassin's hideout. It's underground, near the old temples of Elsera. Talon turned to the guard, his face hardening. Prepare the forces. We'll move out immediately. Zarek's instincts kicked in. He had been in enough crisis situations to know that time was critical. I'll come with you, he said before Talon could say otherwise. I'm not sitting this one out. Veyla's gaze flickered to him, a mixture of relief and apprehension. It's dangerous, she warned quietly. You don't know Khorath Prime the way we do. Zarek met her gaze, determination hardening his features. I'll learn quickly. Without another word, they all made their way to the palace's war room, where maps and holographic projections of the city flickered across the table. Zarek's mind raced as he took in the data. He had no choice but to trust Talon, and reluctantly Veyla, as they planned their next move. Hours later, they were suited up in military garb, the weight of their weapons and armor heavy with significance. Zarek was already feeling the pressure of the situation. The assassin had targeted the heart of the Khorathian government, and if they didn't act quickly, Treacherous could seize power in the chaos. Veyla was silent beside him, her usual composure replaced by a tight-lipped resolve. Zarek couldn't help but feel a surge of empathy for her, the weight of her family's legacy on her shoulders. She wasn't just fighting for political stability, she was fighting for her own survival. As they descended toward the ancient temples of Elsera, Zarek kept his thoughts focused. It was easier to think that way, cutting off all distractions. But Veyla's presence was always there, flickering at the edges of his mind, tugging at him. He found himself next to her again in the temple's cavernous hallways, the atmosphere thick with the weight of ancient history. The walls were covered in intricate carvings, depicting scenes of gods and kings long lost to time. Their footsteps echoed in the vast silence as they made their way deeper into the subterranean ruins. I've heard stories about these temples, Zarek said, his voice breaking the tension. Supposedly they're imbued with the old magic of your people. Veyla glanced at him, her lips curving slightly. Magic, she repeated, almost as if savoring the word. In truth, it's more about energy manipulation. The ancients were masters of controlling the elements. But that knowledge is long gone. Now we simply call it magic. Zarek felt a sudden chill. He had never been one to believe in supernatural forces, but as they passed beneath towering columns that seemed to hum with energy, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. They reached the inner sanctum, where the last traces of the assassin were rumored to be. The air grew colder, and Zarek's senses were on high alert. He looked to Veyla, who nodded slightly, indicating he should stay close. Then they heard it. A low, guttural voice echoed from the shadows. You've come to stop me. Too late. A figure stepped forward, masked and cloaked in dark armor. Zarek's hand instinctively went to his sidearm, but the figure raised a hand, signaling for him to stay still. It's not just Treacherous you need to worry about, the voice rasped before the mask was removed to reveal the face of a Khorathian, one Zarek recognized from the High Council. Veyla gasped. Caius, she whispered. You were always loyal. Caius's eyes gleamed with malice. Loyalty is a commodity, and now it has a price. Zarek's blood ran cold as he realized that the true danger wasn't just the war they had feared. It was the traitors within the very walls they were trying to protect. The price of loyalty had just become far more expensive than any of them could have imagined. The chill in the air thickened as Caius stepped fully into the light, revealing a dark, scarred face that once carried the calm composure of a loyal servant to the throne. But now, his eyes burned with the fire of betrayal, and his lips twisted into a smile that sent a shiver down Zarek's spine. Veyla stood frozen beside him, her grip tightening on her weapon as she took in the sight of the man who had once been a trusted advisor to her family. "Caius," she said, her voice a strange mixture of disbelief and sorrow. "How could you? You've been a part of this family for as long as I can remember. You were my mentor." Caius chuckled darkly, the sound like gravel scraping against stone. "Mentor? I was never your mentor, princess. I was your prisoner. All these years I've waited for the right moment, and now that moment has arrived." Zarek's hand hovered near his sidearm, his instincts screaming that the situation was far more complicated than it appeared. "Why, Caius? Why go this far?" The former counselor's eyes flashed with venom. "Do you understand what you're asking, human? You come from a world that's barely evolved, yet you sit in judgment of Khorath Prime's destiny. My people have been held in chains for centuries, while the coalition grows richer, more powerful, and more corrupt. Sovereign Talon has sold our people's souls for power. I won't stand for it anymore." Veyla flinched at the venom in his words. Her gaze flickered between him and the dark shadows that filled the temple's depths. It was clear she didn't understand. She had grown up in the safety of the palace, surrounded by luxury and privilege, unable to fathom the deep-rooted pain that had festered in Khorath's lower castes. Zarek stepped forward, his voice firm but with a hint of empathy. "You can't just destroy everything in a fit of rage, Caius. There are innocent people who will die if you succeed in this coup. You might have had a point at some point, but this isn't the way." Caius's eyes narrowed, a cruel smile tugging at his lips. "Innocence is a luxury the oppressed cannot afford. The sovereign's power is built on the blood of the many, and I will not let this continue. This is not a coup, it is a reckoning." Veyla's shoulders stiffened. "You don't know what you're doing," she said quietly, though her voice trembled with emotion. "Khorath Prime will descend into chaos if you succeed. Our people, the coalition, Earth, they will all pay the price. There will be no winners." Caius's smile faltered for a moment, but then he took a step forward, his dark eyes gleaming with determination. "I'm prepared to destroy the old to create something new. For once, the price of loyalty won't be paid by the weak." With a swift motion, Caius activated a holographic device on his wrist, and Zarek's pulse quickened as a map of the city appeared, lines of red crossing over key areas. "I've already set the stage," Caius said, his voice cold. "The capital's energy grid is rigged to explode, the trade routes will be severed, and every key political figure will be eliminated. You're too late to stop it." Zarek's heart skipped a beat as he processed the enormity of what Caius had just said. The very future of Khorath Prime, Earth, and the entire coalition was in jeopardy, and there was no clear way to stop it. The stakes had just gone from diplomatic to personal. "You've gone too far, Caius," Zarek muttered. His mind raced, the weight of his responsibility pressing down on him. His people had trusted him to negotiate peace, to secure the future of humanity among the stars. How could he have known that, in doing so, he would have to face betrayal on a galactic scale? Veyla's gaze hardened, her posture shifting. "This ends now," she declared, her voice cold with the certainty of someone who had lived with the consequences of inaction for far too long. Without another word, Veyla raised her hand, and in an instant, the sharp hum of energy weapons filled the air. Caius's voice caught in his throat as he raised a shield, a force field shimmering into existence around him. The energy blast from Veyla's weapon bounced off the shield with a loud crack, but her eyes never wavered. She was no longer the naive princess of a royal family. She was a leader, a warrior. Zarek moved in a blur, drawing his weapon and aiming for Caius's exposed side, just beneath the shield. "Get back," he barked to Veyla, and in a moment of instinct he reached out, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her to safety as the air crackled with tension. Caius growled, his eyes flashing in fury as he slammed a fist against the shield, sending a ripple through the energy field. "You think you can stop me? You think you can fight against fate?" Zarek held his ground, sweat trickling down his temple, and his gaze locked onto the former counselor. "We will fight. And we will stop you." Veyla's eyes burned with an intensity that Zarek had never seen before, her mind a blur of calculations and strategies. "We have to get to the central core of the energy grid. If we can disable it, we can stop the chain reaction and save the city." Zarek nodded. "Lead the way." The two of them sprinted through the ancient corridors, their footsteps echoing, the air thick with the metallic tang of danger. Zarek's heart raced, not just from the physical exertion, but from the overwhelming weight of the moment. The future of Khorath Prime, and perhaps the entire galaxy, hinged on their ability to stop Caius's plans before it was too late. As they approached the core, the room lit up with bright red alarms, signaling that time was running out. Zarek glanced at Veyla, her face a picture of determination. They had no time for second thoughts. They had to act now. The deafening hum of the energy grid's core reverberated through the walls of the chamber, vibrating the soles of Zarek's boots and the pulse in his temples. His breath was shallow, his heart thundering in his chest, but he knew they couldn't afford to hesitate. Every second brought them closer to disaster. Caius's bomb was rigged to trigger once the energy grid hit its critical overload. If they couldn't disable it, Khorath Prime would be lost. Veyla moved with purpose, her every motion sharp and precise as she navigated the array of ancient alien technology surrounding the central hub. The room, a cavernous structure with towering pillars of glowing metal, was an amalgamation of old Khorathian tech and foreign machinery scavenged from the stars. The walls were a shimmering blend of bioluminescent light and sleek, silvered surfaces. It was beautiful and alien, yet deadly, just like Khorath itself. "Caius will be here soon," Zarek muttered, his fingers dancing over the console, attempting to find any way to reverse the detonation sequence. "I know," Veyla replied, her voice tight. Her focus never wavered as she scanned the console next to him, her brows furrowing. "But we can't let him take down everything my father worked for. Khorath Prime is not a tool to be used for vengeance." Zarek swallowed hard. Her words stung. He could sense the weight she carried, her loyalty to her people, to her father, the sovereign of Khorath. The years of struggle for power, the secrecy, the sacrifices. The girl standing beside him was not just the princess of an empire, she was the living embodiment of its complicated future. "We won't let him destroy it," Zarek said, more to reassure himself than her. Veyla turned her piercing blue eyes on him. "You don't understand, Zarek. Khorath Prime is destruction. It always has been. We've lived in the shadow of the sovereign's reign for too long. The people are suffocating." His hand stilled on the console, and he looked at her, seeing the deeper layers of her anguish. The princess who had grown up in the palace, insulated from the truth of the people she was meant to protect. She wasn't just angry at Caius. She was angry at the whole system, the very empire she had been born to lead. But you can't destroy everything just because it's broken. You have to rebuild it step by step. Not tear it down in one night, Zarek said, his voice raw with urgency. For a moment, Veyla's gaze softened, and she turned back to the console, tapping in a sequence of commands. Her expression hardened again as a harsh, cold light filled her eyes. "I don't want to destroy it, Zarek. But I can't rebuild something that's built on lies. The people have to rise up. I have to help them rise." Zarek watched her work, understanding the depth of her struggle, but also seeing the danger in her idealism. The Khorathian people were teetering on the edge of rebellion. All it would take was one spark, one wrong move, and everything would collapse into chaos. He leaned closer, fingers brushing against hers as he navigated through the code with her, bypassing layers of security. "If we don't stop Caius, that's exactly what's going to happen. The rebellion will become something far worse than the sovereign's regime. Chaos will destroy Khorath Prime." Veyla's jaw tightened, but she nodded, her eyes flickering to the countdown flashing in bright red across the console. "I'm not going to let that happen. I won't. Not to my people." Suddenly, a voice echoed through the chamber, cold and mocking. "You're too late, princess." Zarek's hand jerked to his sidearm, and Veyla spun around, her eyes narrowing. Caius stood at the entrance, his tall frame silhouetted by the flickering red light. His cloak billowed behind him like smoke. His expression was triumphant, but his eyes, the same eyes that had once held nothing but loyalty, now burned with a fierce rage. "I told you," Caius said, stepping forward, his gaze fixed on Veyla. "There is no stopping this now. The future belongs to those who are willing to fight for it. You've only ever sat on your throne playing politics while the people suffer. The time for appeasement is over." "Caius, you don't have to do this," Veyla said, her voice barely above a whisper, but the weight of her words hung heavily in the air. Caius laughed, the sound harsh and hollow. "I've given everything for Khorath, and this is the thanks I get? Your father's decadent rule, your family's rule, is nothing but a chain on the people. I will break that chain. If I have to burn this planet to the ground to do it, I will." Zarek could feel the temperature rise in the room as the air grew thick with tension. The energy grid's core began to hum louder, the countdown flashing dangerously close to 0. Veyla stepped in front of him, eyes fierce. You're wrong, Caius. The people don't want destruction. They want change. If you wanted to bring them true freedom, you should have helped us. Together? Together? Caius sneered. You are the princess and I am nothing but a servant. You've never known what it means to fight for your life. Veyla's chest tightened, the weight of his words cutting deeper than she wanted to admit. She was right. In her privilege, she had never truly fought. But what she wanted now was not just power, it was justice. Justice for those who had been cast aside. And if that meant stopping Caius, she would have to be ready for the consequences. Without warning, Caius reached to his side and drew a sleek, glowing dagger, its blade humming with deadly energy. I gave you a chance to walk away, princess. Now you will see that I am the future of Khorath. No? Zarek shouted, moving toward him. Veyla's hand shot out, her own energy blade igniting with a sharp hiss, blocking Caius's strike just as he lunged forward. Sparks flew in all directions, and the force of their collision sent a shockwave through the chamber. For a moment, Zarek was frozen in place, watching the two of them fight, a battle not just for control of Khorath Prime but for their very beliefs. Caius's every strike was fueled by anger, by betrayal, while Veyla's movements were measured, strategic. The countdown kept ticking. Veyla's blade collided with Caius's in a fierce clash, and for one long, pregnant moment their gazes locked. You've lost, Caius, she said quietly, her voice unwavering despite the chaos. Caius's lips curled into a snarl. We'll see about that. Zarek's mind raced. He knew they couldn't keep fighting forever. The countdown was closing in and Caius's plan had to be stopped now. He glanced at the control panel, trying to calculate the quickest way to disable the detonation, before everything was lost. Then, in a flash of insight, it clicked. He grabbed Veyla's arm, pulling her back. Get to the center control, now. I have a plan. Veyla hesitated for a heartbeat but nodded, her face fierce with resolve. They had one shot left. The room seemed to hold its breath as Zarek drew his sidearm and aimed it at the central core. The seconds were running out, but if they could disrupt the grid, disrupt Caius's entire plan, maybe, just maybe, they could save Khorath Prime. The countdown reached its final moments. Do it, Veyla urged, her eyes meeting his. And Zarek pulled the trigger. The blast of energy that erupted from the central core was deafening, shaking the entire chamber as if the planet itself had flinched in pain. Zarek barely had time to brace himself before the shockwave hit, throwing him off his feet and sending him crashing into one of the nearby consoles. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid scent of scorched metal. A low, ominous hum filled the room as the lights flickered and the central grid sputtered, now on the brink of total collapse. Veyla's voice cut through the ringing in his ears, sharp and filled with urgency. Zarek, we need to move, now. His hand shot out, grabbing onto the jagged edge of the console to steady himself. He blinked rapidly to clear the spots from his vision, then focused on her. She was already up, her eyes bright with determination, her hands stretched toward him. Without a word, he took her hand and pulled himself up, wincing as pain shot through his side from where he had hit the console. They were running out of time. The countdown hadn't stopped. The detonation sequence was still in effect, and the grid was overloaded. The blast had destabilized the whole system, but it hadn't disarmed the bomb. If anything, it had set it on a faster course toward detonation. I don't think we have much longer, Zarek said, his voice strained as he glanced back toward the flickering countdown display on the console. It was now at 30 seconds. Veyla's face was hard as stone. We're not going to let Caius win. Behind them, Caius was recovering. He'd been knocked back by the blast, but he was far from defeated. Slowly, he rose to his feet, his eyes burning with unrestrained fury as he glared at Veyla. You think you've won? Caius's voice was low, but it echoed in the chamber with a frightening calmness. His energy blade pulsed with an angry red glow as he stepped forward, eyes locked on Veyla. Khorath will fall. And if I'm not the one to burn it down, you will. Zarek moved to stand between them, raising his gun. That's enough, Caius. You're not destroying anything else. For a moment, Caius looked at him as if sizing him up. You think you're the hero? You think you're the savior of Khorath? His lips curled into a sneer. You're nothing. You're a pawn just like the rest of us. Caius, stop. Veyla's voice was steady now, almost cold. She stepped forward, meeting his gaze without flinching. This isn't you. It never was. You're a better man than this. We can fix this together. Caius's eyes flickered with something, maybe doubt, maybe hesitation, but it was fleeting. His grip tightened on the hilt of his blade and the moment passed. I'm beyond redemption, princess. This is the only way. Before Zarek could react, Caius lunged, his energy blade flashing toward Veyla. Zarek's instincts kicked in and he dove forward, knocking Veyla out of the way just in time. He felt the searing heat of the blade as it narrowly missed his side, the rush of air that followed as the weapon passed inches from him. But the momentum carried Zarek off balance, and before he could regain his footing, Caius twisted and brought the blade down toward him. A scream of frustration tore from Zarek's throat as he raised his sidearm, but his hands were too slow. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as the blow came closer, his whole body bracing for impact. And then the impossible happened. The blade stopped. Veyla was there, her hand pressed against Caius's wrist, her other hand glowing with a soft, ethereal energy as she manipulated his strike. She shoved him back, sending him sprawling against the far wall with a powerful push of energy that sent a shockwave through the chamber. Enough, she said, her voice colder than ice. This ends now, Caius. You can't destroy Khorath with hate. You think your anger will fix things, but all it will do is burn everything to the ground. For a long moment, Caius stayed on the ground, his chest heaving with anger, his face twisted in a grimace of frustration and defeat. But then he lowered his weapon, his energy blade flickering out. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with something close to resignation. I never wanted to burn it all, Veyla, he muttered, his voice barely audible. I wanted to make it better, but you were never listening. You were never there. Zarek watched the two of them, the tension between them palpable, as if the entire weight of Khorath Prime's fate rested on their shoulders. He wanted to speak, to argue, to do anything to break the silence that stretched on between them, but he couldn't. There wasn't time. He turned to the central core. The countdown had dropped to 5 seconds. The tension that had been building in Zarek's chest now reached its peak. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, and it seemed that the entire universe was holding its breath. With a final look back at Veyla, he ran for the console. I'm stopping this, he shouted over his shoulder. You two figure it out, but this bomb is going off. Zarek slammed his palm against the activation panel, trying to override the sequence once more. The system was stubborn, but he could feel it, he was so close. Just a few more seconds. He'd have to reroute the core's power directly into the detonation system, but if he could do it in time. The countdown reached 0. For a moment there was nothing. Then click. A soft, sharp sound as the detonation system froze, the light flickering to a dim, non-threatening glow. The countdown stopped. The danger was gone. Zarek exhaled a breath he hadn't even realized he was holding. The energy field that had threatened to tear Khorath apart had been halted, its pulse stilled. His body went limp with relief. Veyla's voice broke through the silence, hesitant and soft. Did we? Zarek turned, and there was a moment of sheer, overwhelming relief in her eyes as she realized they had won. Caius didn't say anything. He just stood there, his hands empty, staring at the control panel like the fight had gone out of him. Veyla walked over to him, her gaze steady but not without compassion. You don't have to destroy everything to make things right. But you have to start with yourself. Caius didn't speak. He only nodded once, slowly, and then stepped back into the shadows, fading from their view. There was no dramatic exit. Just the quiet, defeated retreat of a man who had lost everything to his own pride. Zarek turned to Veyla, his heart still racing. She had won, but at what cost? What had she truly accomplished here? He didn't know. He didn't have the answers. All he knew was that Khorath Prime was still standing. But for how long? I think we've just begun, Veyla said, her voice distant as she looked at the scorched, now stilled central core. The real fight starts now. Zarek nodded, understanding. It was far from over. But for tonight they had won. In a galaxy teetering on the brink of destruction, Echoes of Khorath tells the gripping tale of betrayal, redemption, and the fragile nature of power. Zarek, a seasoned soldier with a shadowed past, and Veyla, a determined princess caught between political duty and personal desires, find themselves thrust together in a desperate race against time to stop a catastrophic war. As a deadly weapon is set to detonate, threatening to obliterate their home planet, the two must navigate treacherous alliances, confront their shared history, and face the very man they once trusted, Caius, a former ally who believes the planet must be burned to the ground to be reborn. In a world where loyalties shift like the sands of Khorath Prime, Zarek and Veyla must confront the harsh truths about their choices and the cost of saving what remains of their world. With high stakes, a twist of fate, and a final battle for survival, Echoes of Khorath explores what happens when power, love, and ideals collide in a way that leaves nothing untouched. Can they stop the countdown to destruction, Or will the echoes of their past undo everything they fought for? The answers lie in the heart of Khorath itself,